Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report coming off of a nice holiday weekend. I, of course, am your host, Constantine Martelli. We have our co host here at GSP. I hope everyone enjoyed their
Hello.
Thanksgiving Thursday for those of you who are within the heart of the American Empire. There's still a few glimmers of lights here and there, which I think Thanksgiving's one of them personally, but that's just me. It's those couple little things that keep us going despite everything. But we do have quite a bit of news over this past week and a half or so. We tried to get out an episode over the past couple nights, but of course scheduling was a bit of a challenge, as to be expected with a week like this. But without further ado, we'll get right into it, and I'll hand it over to you to cover some of the news, which I'm sure will shock you, that is coming out of Ukraine.
Yeah, so there's a lot of news coming out of Ukraine, but not necessarily on the war front. There have been continued gains by the Russians. Kherson, if we start in the south, Kherson really, both sides are moving troops into Donbass. The Russians, before they left, destroyed some of their electrical equipment generators for their energy supplies for the city, and um, Ukraine has decided to evacuate all of Kherson to Nikolaev and other regions of Ukraine. Uh, there was another attempt to cross the Dnieper to attack the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which from the footage I saw, they didn't even cross the river. If we're still talking about the Zaporozhye region, we've been listening for at least about 6, 7 weeks that the Ukrainians were planning to cut straight down south into Zaporozhye, take Melitopol, and then that would divide the Donbass from Crimea. And from there, they would push outward. One direction probably towards Mariupol, the other one to Odessa. But I think it's becoming clear now that for the time being, Ukraine doesn't have the forces necessary to do this. The Russians slowly have been reinforcing um, their forces with the conscripts, which are around 80,000 so far. Another roughly 250,000 to 300,000 are expected to enter probably before Christmas. Some of them are still in training, but the 3 months since the partial mobilization was called are here. So imagine if there's going to be, a massive front by the Russians, and I stress if, uh, based on the footage I've seen of life in the trenches right now, and lots of equipment getting stuck in the mud, I would say that they would have to wait till the ground is sufficiently frozen. And for that, I think really you're looking at mid-December. It could happen sooner. Some parts of Donbass have snow, as does Kiev. The southern parts, uh, Mariupol, I don't see any snow, not yet. Melitopol, no. Kherson, I think, is a foregone conclusion. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to go for it. Um, Now, the gains that have been happening have developed further. The last show we talked about on the front of Ugledar, the Russians have gained more territory there. They are now attacking Ugledar uh, more ferociously than they were before. Um, they have not been, the Ukrainians have not been able to drive them out. Further north is the town of Marinka, which I believe the Russians control now about 2/3 to 75% from news a day or two ago. And we're recording this on Saturday, the 26th of November. Um, More ground has been gained around Avdiivka. This is one of the areas that are used to bomb Donetsk city, bomb the civilians in the Donetsk city. And The other small gains that have been happening is around Liman. Everybody remembers the great Kharkov collapse in September, where the Russians pulled out. They had insufficient troops. Really, they hadn't even dug themselves in, and a lot of the same kind of criticism could be pointed to Kherson as well. However, there have been small gains. I'm just going to get my map here. So the main thing is the Russians do not want to lose Svatovo or Svatovoye and Kremenaya. Now they run along a highway P07. There are pockets along the way to Kupiansk where about 20 kilometers of this highway is controlled by the Ukrainians. South of that is where the Russians have been making some gains in some of the smaller towns. This has been going on now for quite some time, and they've re-entered parts of that area of Sherwood Forest that is around Yampol, which is north of uh, Slavyansk. So, uh, so not only because of course this would have been very strategic for the Ukrainians. Taking Krasny Liman, as the Russians call it, was actually strategically important because it has a rail service and some supplies were coming in through there. But apparently, it also was used to transport, um, various minerals before the war. So it was quite a hub. Now, the the Ukrainians were basically saying that they would eventually take Kremenaya and Svatove, and then that would be a springboard to recapture Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which the Russians took at the end of June, first few days of July. So um, now, again, these are very small gains, but they are significant. Um, the biggest bit of news, however, is that the Russians have sent an ultimatum to Bakhmut. Uh, the video I saw today, Wagner Group is further inside the city than it has ever been before. And they've sent out an ultimatum by 6 tomorrow that the Ukrainians should leave Bakhmut. That would not leave them completely, uh, without another base of operation. They would have Slavyansk after that, and Kramatorsk as well, right? So it doesn't, you know what I mean? It's taking Bakhmut will not mean like a total collapse, in my opinion. What happens? I don't know, but the Ukrainians have not been able uh, to really push Wagner out of this area. Small gains, again, very small gains in Solidar, increasing the pressure. And of course, from last week, the Russians have taken Opotnoye, which is just south of Bakhmut. This has cut off all north-south traffic between Bakhmut to Avdiivka, which was very important to the Ukrainians. So we'll see. Um, I would say probably by 6 a.m. tomorrow, our time, we'll see if something develops, or by noon, our time tomorrow. Sometime in the morning, we'll see if whatever happens. If the Ukrainians pull out, which I personally doubt they will, uh, it will mean it will be a huge morale crush. It won't be good. They will become very demoralized if that happens. You have to consider that, like, if you exclude Kherson, right, the Russians pulling out of Kherson, is that for about 3-4 weeks, the Russians defended that area very well. The Ukrainians took massive losses, um, gave up very little territory, but then they decided they would leave it, all of it. Um, And as I said earlier, now the town has to be abandoned, even by the Ukrainians. There's no way to supply it with energy. And that's really the big news that we're seeing is that Surovikin has not stopped uh, his strategy in this war, which is to take out energy. The energy that fed uh, Ukraine's military complex is being slowed down. It does come at a cost to civilians, but there is no way around it. And, a lot of Russians were asking in March and April and May, why aren't we taking this stuff out? Now, no bridges are being taken out. That was one of the things that was said before. Um, Command centers. These aren't just recruiting places, but decision-making centers. That has started. It's not quite at the level that I think it needs to be, but that process has begun. The main thing now is Ukraine is struggling basically just to supply heating and water. The videos that I saw out of Kherson were people like literally on the streets getting rainwater or any taps that could have them. And that's why they had to be evacuated. Now, before the war, this was a town of roughly around 300 to 325,000 people. Not a big city, but, or you could call it a town, but not a small town. In any case, they've had to evacuate. And
I mean, all things
I think
considered,
that,
given Ukraine's pre-war population, it was a decent-sized city.
yeah, yeah, it was decent sized. It was just a little smaller than Mariupol, like maybe 100,000, maybe 85,000 people less, but a fairly decent sized town and actually a pretty strategic town. Now, Sirovikin and Putin have both, they've hinted, but particularly Sirovikin, that they're going to eventually recapture Kherson. Uh, that'll be interesting. We'll wait and see what the Ukrainians do, because my guess is if the Russians make an attempt for it, the Ukrainians will blow up the dam. Um, they will see no other way around it. Um, I think that taking out of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has actually slowed down the ability for Ukraine to rearm itself. Of course, we're hearing now news stories in Time magazine, in the New York Times, for instance, that 1/3 of Ukraine's artillery has either been destroyed or no longer works. That artillery has to go to Poland to get refitted and repaired.
In fact, they were actually requesting the U.S. open up new repair facilities in Poland, U.S. or NATO in general. And they also said
Yeah,
that as part of their weapon shipments, which I'll get into a bit of news about the weapon shipment to Poland in a minute here, that they were
yeah,
receiving substandard and damaged weapons, as it were, which would imply that either the U.S. is losing favor with the war effort, or they're scraping the bottom of the barrel, or perhaps one feeds into the other.
right. Um, Now, I think there is exhaustion setting in as far as the polities in Europe. There was another protest today in Germany against the war. Moldova has also had blackouts now because of the energy that Ukraine has been able to provide for Romania. Some of this energy has also been depleted that was going to Poland, right? So I think now it's setting in on them like what Russia could have fully done in the winter and early spring if they had chosen to. And this is what has brought about some in the Biden administration, not all, but some, including Milley, to ask Zelensky to negotiate, right? Um, Zelensky, of course, still refuses to negotiate. So that, because Zelensky is also a puppet as well, that to me means that there is a dispute within American elites as what to do. Probably, neocon elements, neolib elements, such as Ann Applebaum Sikorsky, who's not American, but he's married to Ann Applebaum. Probably Bill Kristol, probably a whole Newland, Kagan, all those people are, I'm very sure, are pushing Zelensky to fight harder because I mean, you even have Jens Stoltenberg, for instance, saying that if they lose, Europe won't be safe. He's made other statements. If we lose, um, this will be looked at as a tremendous defeat of NATO the world over, and he's not wrong about that. That is the case. Um, so I would say that the Russians are committed to this slow, steady grind. We will see in the next few weeks when the ground freezes over whether there are going to be any big sweeping offensives or not. In the short term, we look for in the next 24 hours to see what happens in Bakhmut. Now, there's other sort of news that's tangential to Ukraine. If you wanted to get into that,
Well, we do have a bit of a follow up on the missile story from last
oh
week.
yes,
So
I'm glad you brought that up.
I imagine this is as close as you're going to get to an apology or retraction from the Associated Press that they
Yes.
fired the journalist who broke the story about the headline of Russian missiles hitting Poland. Of course, there was no official retraction. There was no reneging. That they'll put a caveat at the bottom of the article saying, "Well, this actually happened," but they axed the guy who put out the story in the first place. So, saving face, and as I said, that's probably the closest you're actually even going to get to an apology when it comes to something like this. You began mentioning the disputes over whether Zelensky should be allowed to begin the negotiations process or whether the fighting should continue in the divide among the American and the Western elites with that. You do have the British who are far more adamant about this war continuing. And this will get into some of our European news. But we were actually having
Oh,
an off show discussion about this that I wanted to bring up. Where,
yeah. And I have just one
yeah,
more
go ahead.
thing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and that is, and I'm sorry for saying that that's it. I've just reminded myself, and that is two incidents where the Ukrainians basically slaughtered Russian POWs. That has received bad press as well. Not as bad as we'd like, certainly not. The Ukrainians have been doing this for many, many, many years. Many videos of tortures and killings. You can find them on VK if you can't find them in Western media. I have a number of them. Just for people who want to counter me, should an argument ensue about Ukraine, um, because basically that Western Banderist ideology is the ideology that runs Ukraine right now. Um, anyhow, so there was some bad press. The Western media tried very hard to say, "Oh, it's indeterminate." It's kind of like the lead scientist for the IAEA saying, "Oh, it's still very hard for us to determine who is shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant." I mean, he knows very well it's the Ukrainians, right? That plant is closed now, but there are other nuclear plants that are run by the Ukrainians, which are also closing because of the sustained effort by the Russians to knock out Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So, um, yeah, it's very disgusting videos. I've seen them. Uh, Very cruel. There was no need to do that. Apparently in one of the footages from northern Donbass in the backyard of someone's home, they said that the last person to come out of hiding was not willing to or whatever. But there's no one there with any guns. All of them had surrendered. If they were so afraid of him, they could have just taken him out. Everybody else was lying on the ground at that moment. So very deceptive. But remember that the Ukrainians are emboldened to do this because they know The one thing that Americans have is the best propaganda machine in the world, and people still consider it, for some reason, an authority on truth. And even if they tacitly disagree with it, uh, they will have to work hard, especially normies, to disbelieve an article. And I think this ties in
The
with what
Empire's
AP.
media apparatus gets to set the narrative, and everyone
Yeah,
else gets the pleasure of responding, as it were. Where, although, of course, Russia has media, China has media, and while they do try to propagate their own narratives, seldom do they get anywhere, and more often than not, their media cycles, their narrative cycles, are merely a response, a reaction to
right.
the narratives being driven out of places like New York and Washington, D.C.
Exactly. And I think this is why I think AP felt it was important, even though there was kvetching on Twitter about this. You have to understand, AP is like one of those news sources, not unlike Reuters, that there's less editorializing and commentary in their supposedly uneditorialized reporting, right? They're expected to be more neutral, right? Because there is a kind of hierarchy in propaganda in the West. So you have like AP will break a certain story, right? But you don't know about AP. That's because that information is then used by CNN, MSNBC, and then that's when the editorializing begins. And they will link it to AP. So AP, I think, for its reputation, had to get rid of him. So
Oh,
that's
yes.
just a little thing I wanted to mention
Well, it's
about
okay because
how Western media works.
I'm sure he has a job lined up at one of the aforementioned organizations if worse comes to
Oh
worse.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, and as you know, these people cycle through each other, and they're always exchanging. It's a very, for lack of a better word, incestuous cycle where they're all attached to the hip. Even, and I know that I don't think anyone here is going to be a great defender of Fox News sites. Maybe the occasional Tucker Carlson clip, but it should surprise you that even the so-called right-wing media is also part of this ecosystem and plays just as much into it. So,
but you know what? You
yeah,
brought up the missile, and I
oh
wanted to
yes,
ask you. Now that a week or so has gone by, what do you think? Do you think, because I saw a South Front article that, in passing, it said, based on the latest info, we think that this was done intentionally by Ukraine. Uh, what do you think?
I still maintain, and I forgive me if I didn't allude to this clear enough last episode, that it was quite literally an opportunity that fell out of the sky for them. That they didn't concoct this; it was just something that landed in their lap, and they probably anticipated a scenario like this, so they had stuff drafted up that they could have edited here and there and put out within a short amount of time. But once again, when they sit on something for 4 or 5 hours before they do that,
Yeah,
that's because they need time to put something together to throw out there. When
yeah.
something is far more coordinated, say for example the chemical attacks in Syria, they almost immediately have something about it ready to
Yeah.
put out.
Yeah, I think it's one of those rare instances with me that I kind of disagreed with South Front, who is almost always 100% right. Um, yeah, there was a lot of sitting, even if Ukraine's firing of the S-300 missiles was uh, intentional, right? As you say, it was not coordinated with Poland. Someone along the way, let's suppose that was what happened. Somewhere along the way, someone got scared, and there was no proper narrative, or there was a disagreement on the narrative. Then they went for it 5 hours later, and you had a farmer with a cell phone take photos of the missiles, and the markings, the language on them is Ukrainian, and basically it's over. The story is dead. Um,
And that's also to
and
mention the Polish investigation gave the cold shoulder to Ukraine, where it, once again,
yeah,
if this were something that were, say, for example, like Syria in 2018, it would have been a very cooperative endeavor. That, of course, the Ukrainians can participate in the investigation. Of course, they can come along with this.
Yeah.
Of course, they can have full access to this information. But no, the Polish investigators, even all the way up into the Polish government, had a very cold attitude towards Ukraine over this entire process, even now. And even while the investigation is still ongoing to some degree, they haven't warmed up or thawed out or anything to the point where Poland is still shutting out Ukraine, at least in terms of this investigation.
Right. It reminds me of the whole so-called Bucha massacre that there was like nearly 3 days to sit on it, and then they came up with the story. But Ukraine has never allowed the UN or any country besides Britain to investigate it, and that I think leads very well into what you wanted to say about Britain with regards to Ukraine.
So, while the narrative in Washington or the ideas coming out of Washington are a bit split down the middle at this time, trying to decide whether negotiations should be allowed or whether they should keep pushing forward, our favorite Ben Wallace has come out and advocated the Ukrainians continue to push forward even into the winter. And he has probably become, out of at least all the public officials, out of people who actually hold a position of power, at least publicly, the most hawkish voice on Ukraine, I would say, is Ben Wallace by far. And that's even
Oh
including
yeah.
some of the American congressmen. Like, I mean, uh, what's his name? Kinzinger, that one Republican congressman out of Illinois or whatever, the one who had the NAFO profile picture that was
Uh,
just horrid. And I'm sure his ethno-religious background won't come as a shock to any of you, and I'm sure his political positions outside of that will not come as a shock to any of you. But even the hawkish members of the U.S. government, and especially in Congress, are put to shame by Ben Wallace, who is advocating that this conflict keeps being agitated, it keeps being pushed forward, and it has become a very strange dynamic between the US and the UK, not only over this recent conflict, but I would say since Brexit. So, just to give a little bit of background that I'm sure isn't necessary for most of you, but just to tie everything together for the sake of bringing this point together. In 2016, you had the Brexit vote, and the British people vote to leave the European Union. And of course, that's a process that is much longer than it should be. It took until the beginning of 2020 to even officiate the exit. You had that, and then, of course, about 6 months later, actually a little bit less than 6 months later, Trump gets elected, Trump assumes office. So there's this general feeling among, you could say, more right leaning people on both sides of the Atlantic that perhaps there's potential for a new so called Anglo bloc to form, not divorced from Europe, but has a healthy distance from Europe. That's what it seemed like in 2017, 2018, whatever. Then, situation 2019 onward started to take a much more drastic direction because Brexit was fumbled and you had the negotiations being drug out. You had the European Union making this process as difficult as possible for the British. You had a brief moment of European rebellion under Macron in relation to Trump. Now, you'll notice, and I'll get into some of the news about France in a minute here, that since Biden has assumed office, Macron is a good Atlanticist, and he is,
oh yeah.
yeah, he's going along with it. Now, sure, he'll play the other, he'll play the narrative other, where he'll say things like, "Of course, we were not going to get in a nuclear conflict over Ukraine. Of course, we need to be reasonable about this. Of course, negotiation should be allowed." So he gets to play the once again the controlled opposition voice, but he is by and large the good Atlanticist. I mean, not that he ever was on our side or had any ideas, but he was much more of a firebrand under Trump, and that is indisputable. So you had that
Yeah.
process, and now you have the
But I
Brit.
but I would argue he was trying to do two things at once. On the one hand, he was trying to out Atlanticist or out neoliberal Trump, right? In a sense, speaking effectively to the Democrat Party in the US and their interests, but also the Republicans and the neocons, right? At the same time, with Merkel, and we'll get into Merkel later, he's trying to form a kind of security arrangement with an EU army outside of American influence,
Oh,
which
he
is
he
bizarre
he
because,
completely lifted that from De Gaulle and what his foreign
yeah,
policy and approach to France and Europe was. So, which I think is, I'll say this much, I think is kind of something you have to do in French politics, whether or not you agree with it. It's just something that is ingrained in the French political consciousness that there needs to be that spirit of at least semi-independence from the American Empire, from whatever organization that France has to be a leader. So again, it plays that at home, then it plays that abroad, and talking about more European independence. And of course, I don't have them with me, but the infamous maps about the projection of what countries will do with their foreign policy under a Trump presidency versus a non-Trump presidency. You'll recall that
I,
both
yeah,
that both
I
France and
just think he saw
yeah.
weakness in Trump. I
Oh
think
yeah,
he
absolutely.
looked at Trump.
He smelled blood in the water. He thought that he could be the neoliberal poster boy as opposed to the office of the American president, as is traditional, as is the case now with Biden back in office.
Right, and he's not asking. He wasn't actually asking for like more independent. I mean, in a sense, yes, he's asking for independence. But where he differs from De Gaulle is he wants to form a closer tie with Germany and determine Europe on a different footing. That's where he no longer could make the real boss,
Oh
which
yeah,
is Brandon, happy.
yeah.
Right, so
Don't get me
he
wrong.
was really,
When I say De Gaulle, I mean a completely bastardized form to play
yeah,
into the
okay,
French populace rather than any genuine De Gaullism. Because I mean,
right, right,
if
right,
that were
right.
the case, Europe would not look like it does now. I mean, and I like to harp on this all the time. I'm getting a little off track, but if there were actually a real changing of the guard in France, once again, France sneezes, Europe catches a cold, that is probably the best vector for an Atlantic divorce, as I would like to call it. But
Hmm,
I'm getting a
hmm.
little off track here. Another time, I would like to get further in depth about those subjects. But you have that. You have the British stuck between a rock and a hard place, with the European Union making this divorce process as painful as possible, and the Americans not necessarily delivering what they would have expected to the point where it becomes, rather than what many would have expected to be an equal partnership, to something that is becoming eclipsed by the Americans, becoming an American satellite in Europe more than they already so are. But it seems somewhere along the line, there's been a certain faction of the British establishment, which I would say includes Ben Wallace, who have somewhat embraced this. So you have this growing idea within many British elite circles, at least vague idea, that of course we're going to use this Ukraine war, we're going to use these various vectors of pressure to bring Russia into submission, and then when the resource market is opened back us, our generous masters in Washington are going to let the British oversee the distribution and control of Russian resources flowing into Europe, where they get to become
Right,
the branch manager of the empire, so to speak. Which,
right.
at this point, with the position the UK has wedged itself in, with the adversarial foreign policy towards Russia and China, with the contentious relationship with the European Union, and with no real bargaining power over the United States, and really even a failure to reach out to other Commonwealth nations. One of the other things that was speculated for a while is that they would form some sort of common market or common political union with the Canadians, British, and Australians, but and New
Hmm.
Zealand and other former British colonies that were still uh, under the Commonwealth. I mean,
An expansion of the Five Eyes, as
yes,
it were.
yes. That was their initial plan, but of course that never really came to fruition. So they found themselves in this position, and really the last hope the British have in maintaining any relevance is once again to support the American Empire going into overdrive, as we saw with them in Afghanistan. You'll recall there was more outcry in British Parliament than the U.S. Congress over the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, because they need to be the second fiddle of that. They have put themselves in a position almost comparable to Poland and Israel, where their existence and relevance is completely contingent on a very strong and boisterous American empire.
Right, but, and I think that they have a dual purpose as well, because we remember Boris Johnson sailed aircraft carriers without aircraft on them to Taiwan to provoke the Chinese. And then he nearly got one of his boats bombed by getting into Russian waters along the shores of Crimea. Um, but I think there's a kind of a dual purpose going on, not all that different than Macron, because they kind of see both the limitations of being under more direct control by the Americans, and at the same time, a perception that America maybe is becoming weaker because its policies are so inflexible. A case of brittleness and shrieking, a kind of you must choose or else. So I think with the British as well, they've been used to being, for the last 200 years, probably the most relevant European country in Europe. And, they don't want to lose that. So on the one hand, they want to be America's, like aggressive poodle, that is, in the same way that European liberals and Canadians want to out liberal even American liberals, right? This has been a mainstay in European and Western histories from World War II onwards in a very big way, especially if you're my age. Um, so I think with the British, on the one hand, yes, they want to signal to the Americans just how on board they are, maybe even more enthusiastically than the Americans themselves. But the dual purpose is, as you say, they don't want to lose relevance in Europe, and this is why being under more American control, while America looks less strong and more brittle, uh, I think it's exacerbating this kind of behavior. There's a kind of an urgency about what they're doing.
Yes, and like I said, it reminds me a lot of what you see out of Poland and a lot of what you see out of Israel, where it is an urgent matter and is something that they feel their entire relevance as a nation going into the future is completely contingent on. That they need
Mm-hmm.
to be that outlet, that they need to be that satellite of the empire, that they need to be that spearhead that can be fallen back on in times of crisis. And Ukraine has given them an opportunity to try to go above and beyond on this, to the point where once again they're even outdoing the heart of the empire in that matter, and even trying to outdo Biden and his administration. As you mentioned, it is once again that desire by European liberals, by Anglosphere liberals, to almost prove themselves worthy by showing how much above and beyond they can even go than the liberal establishment in DC, in New York, within once again the heart of the American empire.
Mm-hmm.
And with that being said, I do have several pieces of European news. So, starting with the energy crisis, you have Russia, which has said it will not sell to nations which do implement the price ceiling on Russian oil because although the sanctions have been lifted, there have been waivers, but the caveat is we're still going to punish Russia by refusing to pay over a certain amount for their oil. And of course, when there's that, there's still several nations in the world, several even wealthy nations in the world that are willing to pay for Russian oil without the market cap. You even have Tunisia, which has become a hub for Russian oil. It was reported that they were selling Russian oil to South Korea, which is a nation that has, of course, gone along with the sanctions regime. So
Mm-hmm.
you've had this happen in countries like Egypt, you've had this happen in Saudi Arabia. The Middle East is becoming, and perhaps this is stereotypical of the Arab, but they're becoming the middlemen traders once again. And, I suppose as unipolarity collapses, people returning to more traditional roles is no surprise. So you have a bunch of North African middlemen and North African merchants buying products from one part of the world, selling them to another part of the world. You have to appreciate the sentiment behind that, at least somewhat. At least I do. So continuing on, with some of the more surprising news out of Europe. You have Hungary, which has agreed to sign on to Finnish and Swedish NATO membership. But it came with a caveat that they will not sign on to this until the new year, and that they said they were going to be postponing it. And of course, this coincides with the European Union beginning to freeze Hungarian accounts and cut off Hungary's financial supply due to their ongoing feud with Brussels on a number of matters, whether that be foreign policy related, especially to Russia, or due to their migration policy, or due to their various social issues, whether that be the LGBTQIA thing, or just a number of topics. Of course, I'm sure I don't need to explain to all of you the ongoing feud between the European Union and Hungary. But they have capitulated insofar as that is concerned. Now, Orban has always been like Erdogan in the sense that he does not pick too much of a side on any given conflict. Now, given the circumstances of the conflict in Ukraine, he has been very anti, at least the current approach by NATO. Now, of course, he hasn't threatened to leave NATO. He hasn't threatened to leave the European Union. Not that he's really in the position to. But he has refused to let the war to expand to a degree where it would threaten Hungarian interests. He has been reluctant to go along with any punishment or sanctions package. Of course, at all the UN and EU votes, he votes to issue the statements of condemnation, whatever. But he has been pretty adamant about not expanding NATO any further, at least into Finland and Sweden. Now, at this point, if we're going to take Orban at his word and assume that when the new year comes, he doesn't say, we'll look into it in a few months, which very well could be the approach he does, where you have this for a variety of different political matters, both in domestic and foreign policy all across the world, where there's a hot button issue that a leader does not want to touch, that politicians do not want to touch, but they're not in a position to categorically reject. So they just keep kicking the can down the road. A prime example of this is actually the act to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem was passed in, I believe it was 1994 or 1995, under Bill Clinton. And every subsequent administration would sign a waiver every 6 months saying, we'll do it 6 months from now, we'll do it 6 months from now, we'll do it 6 months from now. The first person not to do that was, of course, Trump, when he said, we're moving it. That's just to give an example of how these processes work. So it very well could be a back and forth game where Orban says, yeah, we'll look into this in 6 months. 6 months pass, we'll look into it in another 6 months. So while the initial statement did seem very disheartening, and I'm not saying definitively one way or another, him saying that we're going to postpone it until 2023 hints at, especially with somebody with the political approaches of Orban, that it is going to be something that he delays as long as possible. Now, the question is, how much patience does Brussels have for something like that? And I mean Brussels as in both the European Union and NATO. Because once again,
Right.
keep in mind that they've already started to impose what are more or less financial sanctions on Hungary. You have the freezing of several Hungarian accounts by the European Union. You have the threatening to withhold funds. And once again, touching on these issues that have been going on since at least 2015. Now,
Right. I mean, they will use the war to cripple Hungary in the same way that lockdowns crippled small businesses and destroyed hundreds of thousands, not just in the U.S. but millions worldwide. So that they're counting on that basically. Besides just the sanctions, um, in a way, you know, because it's Orban and because it's Hungary, it's special to us. But the real linchpin here will be Turkey,
oh,
and
absolutely. And
there's a lot going on there. But who knows? I mean, I think in many ways, Sweden and Finland being in NATO was always like it was a done deal even before the war broke out. It was inevitable that it would happen. America needed a pretext. The war solves that.
I mean,
Uh,
arguably, when you look at the security agreements that exist between NATO and Finland and Sweden, they are effectively NATO members in all but name. This is just a formalization of the current agreements.
Exactly. And that striving for European independence that we saw take place during the Trump years, at the same time, uh, basically voicing opinions that run parallel to, uh, the DC liberal establishment, that too had to be stopped. So, like, one of the things we said that when Biden was elected was that he will not have a policy that's like radically different from Trump's against China or Russia. In fact, it will be even more severe. And a lot of people didn't believe us. Um, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because they still want to believe, like, I don't know, that either a certain party or an individual has more power than they actually do, especially when it comes to geopolitics, which was, a very strange thing. A lot of people ride on copium, and so it's been interesting to see, Biden crack down even harder on Europe than Trump would have. Um, and the whole time they had to have this, duplicity, like, oh, he's not a real leader, so we can actually gain some independence from America. And the way we do it is by voicing opinions that are reflected by elite America that has power over Trump, right?
Oh,
Like that was
it's a
that.
complete back and forth dynamic where,
Yeah,
although
yeah,
I'm not saying that Trump was complete controlled opposition, at least at first, or that they let him in, but once they got him in, they let him do things very strategically. For example, we all know there were certain lines that Trump crossed during the campaign that he would not even thought about crossing in the White House.
yeah.
And you could say a lot of the stuff regarding uh, a lot of foreign policy matters happened with that. But the lines he was allowed to cross by the empire, as it were, such as, again, browbeating Europe, talking about the NATO funding, going over there and clowning around and having those goofy meetings with Merkel and chucking starbursts at her. They send it is almost, for lack of a better term, a good cop bad cop routine where you send in Trump, he goes in, he breaks all the toys, he makes a mess. Then Biden comes in, everyone breathes a sigh of relief, the adults are back in the room. But guess what? Now that you've been acculturated to it, now that you've had a taste of it, he's going to twist your arm even harder, and you're going to act like you're actually being given a break, that you're being given mercy by the next guy. And it's funny. I don't want to, uh, for no pun intended, trump myself up too much, but I remember upon Biden's election. I don't know. Maybe I deleted this because sometimes you just purge these sort of things, but one of the first tweets I made upon the Biden presidency was, it was some mainstream media article talking about Europeans are celebrating the adults being back in the room in Washington, and then I just simply quote tweeted and said, the Europeans celebrate the adults being back in the room in Washington as Biden sanctions them into oblivion for buying Russian energy. Which, I mean,
Right,
yeah,
right,
look what
right.
happens just 2 years later, and I mean, look,
The thing is, the Americans saw right through it, right? Like, while, basically Merkel and Macron's argument was the adults are not in the room. Oh my God, we're going to have to go really independent in order to sustain Europe, and our values, which are America's values as well. And then Biden gets elected and says, "Oh yeah, you think you will? Okay, I'll test you." And now they have to fork out incredible amounts of money after 2 years of COVID. They're depleting their military. They will have no industry. It was real. It's like you say. Maybe it was a good cop, bad cop routine by the U.S. all along. If it wasn't, it worked marvelously. The Europeans. I mean, I don't fault them because they never. I mean, they lost all their power after World War II, anyways. And that was the great part of a greater overarching plan for American dominance to begin with. So,
yeah,
but
there was
you know,
never
they, they
really
were they
much
were
of a
trying to
choice in
be
the
too
matter.
clever.
Yeah, but
Pardon me.
there was never really much of a choice in the matter on at least
Yeah,
most European parts. And
yeah,
even to this day, they're completely. I said this about Germany, and for Germany it rings especially true. But when you extrapolate it out to Europe, when you look at the structure of the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe, many of the agreements, many of the treaties we have with Europe now make these countries colonies in all but name. Under every other precipice, every other agreement that we have, the way we interact with these nations is a master servant relationship. It's not that of equals. And once again, especially when it comes to European liberals. Now, when it comes to European conservatives and rightists, that's a completely different issue I'm not going to touch right now. But when it comes to European liberals, I mean, of course, they're happy that the liberal empire has come about, but there is there is a touch of resentment, at least from my observation, that it
Mm.
comes from North America and not them. That they're merely, as I said before, the branch managers of this, which fuels this desire to go above and beyond, which fuels this desire to become the ultra American, to become the hyper Americanized European liberal, as we see time and time and time again. And that was the entire dynamic between Trump and the European Union, the major leaders of the European Union during his presidency, and of course, as we described the dynamic with Biden, of course they all rejoiced and sang a sigh of and sang songs of praise and breathed a sigh of relief once he came back into power. Once the Democrats came back into power, but it was shown a certain seal had been broken, and the United States, the American empire, being able to explicitly treat Europe the way it does was a taboo that was broken under Trump, and probably one of the greatest things that he ever gave to the empire. Now, sure, he was a Zion Don. He did a lot of stuff for Israel. I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that he was out the ears with the more traditional neocon Zionists. Don't get me wrong. But I would say
Mhm.
even greater to the empire was the establishment of the norm that Europe can be treated that way when it comes to our diplomatic relations. Now, of course, at the time, and even still now, I wasn't going to bat for Europe. I wasn't going to bat for NATO or the European Union, I mean, because it's all part of the same system, and I think everyone fundamentally
Yeah.
understands that. But once again, you'll you notice the cry for independence don't start until then, and then when Europe is actually pushed into overdrive, when Europe is actually pushed into the much more subservient position, they're more loyal than ever.
It reminds me of, that Roman technique where there would be a populace that they had recently conquered, let's say Celts in southern France, and maybe it was one or two generations old, and but there were still uprisings, and the people. Like what the Romans would do is they would go in and they would punish the governor, sometimes killing him, and they would replace the governor with one of their own, right? But their own would be even more indoctrinated uh, with Rome and sustaining Rome's power over them than the governor that they got rid of. He would be even more cruel than the one they used to complain about. And in many ways, they put up with it because at least he was one of their own.
Yeah, it sounds once again more or less exactly the same. Now, I do have some other European news on that front, and some very present European news given that current statement. So, Macron has called for a single global order under the U.S. and said that China is making a mistake by challenging it. Ladies and
Press
gentlemen,
me harder, Daddy.
ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Jupiterian president. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the man whose thoughts are too complex for journalists to understand. I give you all of the trumping up Macron did of himself in 2017, set before his submissive position to Washington and to Brussels at this time. And there's really no other way to put it that this man was supposed to be the kingmaker of Europe. He was supposed to forge a new order. And like again, there was even some infatuation on the right, which I was certainly guilty of myself. Don't get me wrong, of the idea of perhaps a more independent European order under French leadership. Which again,
We
theoret
all wanted it.
yeah, I mean theoretically, once again, I support that. But that, you're kidding yourself if you think that somebody like Macron or the current French political establishment is ever going to deliver anything like that. They'll deliver
Yeah,
it.
he can't.
Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, they'll deliver it under American management. But once again, I've said this in previous episodes, and I'll reiterate. In order to accomplish anything of that degree, Europe would need to wage an outright war of independence against the United States. And
Oh yeah.
I don't say that as like a metaphorical war. I don't say that as like an economic war. No, I'm saying European nations would actually have to coalesce and take to arms and establish themselves, which once again probably would lead to outright conflict with the U.S. at that point, in order to ever be sovereign nations again. And I don't think that's hyperbole at all.
Yeah, I don't know if it's going to happen. I mean, in a way, um, because of this war, which arguably Trump was less willing to commit to. Um, there might be all kinds of reasons. Maybe they weren't ready 2 years ago the way they're more ready now. Maybe it was something else. Maybe we'll find out in the future. But the incredible amount of, because there are now French and German articles highlighting just how deindustrialized Europe is going to be and how upset they are by this. In a way, it highlights America's mistrust of Europe. That um, the favor that America did for Europe in World War II um, is so inarguable that uh, you know Europe must accept its fate under American dominance forever. There can never
And
be any kind of
and
independence.
it is two pronged because for nations like France and others, it is a gratitude guilting, as I call it. You should be grateful that we
Yes,
liberated you.
gratitude guilting,
But
very
then
good.
for a nation like Germany, it is just outright guilting. We're saying, well, if we leave, you'll rise up again, and you'll be a blight on this continent, and you'll be an oppressive force. So that's why we have to stay here to manage you. So it's this very
Hmm.
two pronged thing where they gratitude guilt these countries like France, where of course, hey, we saved you, we liberated Europe, and then when it comes to once again nations like Germany, it is that well, you're being punished and you're still beholden to these post-war treaties, and you can't even have a military of certain calibers because look what you did last time and post 1945 gobbledygook. So it's this very, once again, 1-2 punch that they can throw at virtually all of Europe because they fit under 1-2 categories, either the liberated or the ones who were brought to justice. And that's going to be an internal order so long as the American Empire has the means and ability to exert itself upon Europe, it will be there. And it would take probably an internal collapse of the American Empire, if even, and who knows, you could have some of the, let's just say, more radical predictions come true in the United States, and they would still be holding on to the empire abroad, especially in Europe. And at that point, like I will reiterate, it is a continent under complete subjugation, and barring any major blow to the American empire, that is going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. And this also goes back to the Stoltenberg comments about Ukraine that if we lose in Ukraine, we lose big because that is now I don't think it's the thing that would do it, but that is a major blown confidence to the current system. That is something that would be able to inch it ever closer to actually being a system where the American empire becomes more and more defunct. And that is why they have sunk everything into this. Now, on that note, they've sunk everything into this to the point where 20 of 30 NATO nations, and that's two-thirds, have
Yeah.
said at this point their supplies are being depleted to the point where they cannot supply the Ukrainian war effort to a sufficient level. And as we discussed earlier in the show, you have them requesting the U.S. dedicate more effort to repairing artillery pieces in Poland, and you also have them reporting that the artillery pieces they've received are already dysfunctional by the time they receive them before they even see action. So that is the level it is getting to, and that is the level in which they will once again sink everything into Ukraine because they've bet everything on it. And
Yeah.
In order for the empire to succeed, it has to succeed, and Russia must be dislodged. Not only must Russia be dislodged, it must be dislodged to pre 2014 borders, Crimea included, and must see an internal regime change. That is how much they've put into this, to the point where if there's going to be any payoff, and that's a big if, that exact chain of events would have to happen probably within the next 2 years, if we're being honest. Time is not a commodity that I would say either side really has at this point, especially not the NATO side.
Yeah. This is what makes me afraid of like various escalation paths for this war, in that they've already made these comments. Like you make comments like we cannot lose this war because it would like if it really were that kind of war, right? Like if it were on the scale of World War II. Now
Yes, and
it's
I know
no,
we were actually critical of Putin a couple episodes back for doing much the same thing to the Russian public, but you do look at it, the exact same thing is happening on the NATO side as well, where it's the it's
yeah, I
the
mean
most
the
pivotal
difference
war in
is though
ages.
is
Yes,
like it is an existential threat to Russia, but it's not to America, and it's
yes,
not even an existential threat to any other country in Europe. So it is tangibly different in that
yeah.
sense. But
I wouldn't call it a one for one, but you can see how the rhetoric kind of converges and almost
yeah,
becomes a mirror image of
yeah.
each
Well,
other.
that's a good point. Maybe they feel they have to mirror Putin's rhetoric in order to sustain interest in the war. Um, but I think after the missile fiasco of a week or two ago, I'm guessing the states probably does not want the war to escalate outside of Ukraine's boundary. And I think the longer this war goes on, the less likely you're going to see other countries wanting to engage Russia. Remember, like when this war started, particularly in the first 4 months, you had Lithuania provoking Russia by cutting off Kaliningrad. You know, you had a lot of like tricky stuff going on where the Europeans wanted to egg on Russia even further. Now, you could argue that Finland and Sweden joining NATO will be an attempt, maybe in a few decades, to cut off St. Petersburg. It's very possible. You know, I don't know. I don't think that's something that they're willing to escalate right now. Like, I will say this. Putin gave a speech recently with like mothers of deceased sons who have died in the war or who were maimed, and you get the sense that the Russians are more united than the Europeans were thinking they would be at this stage. Um, he allowed criticism. It should also be noted, like the Soviets never did this. I'm not sure even if Tsarist Russia did this. I just don't know. If somebody knows in the chat, they can tell us. But Stalin certainly never did this. And they criticized that like they didn't have proper outfits, the wrong camouflage clothing was either too heavy or whatnot, and um, but you get the sense that they're more unified. Putin, even after Kherson and Kharkov, his popularity is still pretty good. It's still in the 70s, mid 70s, and I don't think it can take many more blows, but um,
And mind you, I will
let's
reiterate once again, the disapproval far more comes from the people who, if given the opportunity, would expand this war rather than the people who are opposed to it blanketly.
absolutely, like if the Americans wanted to oust Putin, they would get Putin to go to the negotiating table and sue for peace and like give away half of what he's already taken, and um he can take all the people um from those regions that he will be forced to abandon. Do you know what I mean? That would spell, I think, his end.
Oh yeah, if they were able to negotiate a peace where again he got to keep the population and let's just say the borders were drawn for a recognition at least of like some sort of autonomous Donbass, but again if some sort of very token peace offer were given that and Putin accepted, that would be the end. Now of course there's the problem. The people who replace him certainly wouldn't be the Navalny's of the world. It would be the Zhirinovskys of the world, just to use a very crude example.
But I think what the West is counting on, I agree with you, but I think what the West is counting on is as soon as that happens, um,
Oh,
that
more
new leader
instability, of
who will be
course.
right, because then the liberals will get deactivated. What you'll see is accounts that were frozen from the beginning of the war that the Americans froze. Because, like one of the strange things that the Americans have done is you have like Russian dissidents, like here in Canada, and they're trying to get their money out through um, um, like through American banks. And, um, they don't want to fight in the war. They don't think the war should have started in the first place. And they're being completely alienated. Well, um, my guess is, something very similar that happened to all the oligarchs, right? And people were expecting, as I'm sure even the Americans were expecting, because I think the Americans felt in the first 3 months the Russian economy is going to tank. They certainly felt that way, especially in the first 2 months. And if it did, like, let's say they capitulated on some level, Putin was replaced, right? All those oligarchs that flew to Israel, their bank accounts wouldn't be, they would not get frozen, right? They would be unfrozen, and then they would have massive amounts of money to pour in for a Navalny type, maybe even a Navalny, and that would go against a Zhirinovsky type. I think that's their plan, basically.
Oh yes, and I would completely agree with you. While of course when it comes to popular support, the dissatisfaction comes from people who want to expand the war. The mere vacuum of power, even as temporarily left by Putin, even if it were to be replaced by somebody who was much more hardline, would open the door to such that even if they were able to assume power, they would be so bogged down by such a well-funded liberal opposition that it could, if not collapse the system, grind it to a halt.
Right,
Which would be
right.
the goal at the very least if they didn't outright succeed. And you actually, and there's a little bit of news about Kazakhstan. I still want to let develop before we touch
Yes,
too
yes,
much.
definitely. And Merkel.
Yes, but you saw the same thing when Nazarbayev left power in Kazakhstan, where almost
Hmm.
immediately there was an attempt at a color revolution. And I once again I hate to praise myself too much, but that is something that we had said would happen. That merely the change in the guard, the small crack left open in the door, would be enough for somebody to shove their foot in and try to force something into Kazakhstan, which has been attempted
Right.
multiple times, including in this past week as well. But I do have a bit of European news I do want to cover. So, according to the Prime Minister of Portugal, Antonio Costa, the European Union will not be able to accept new members, and that includes Ukraine as well. So, that shows
Huh.
that once again you do have within the European Union sentiments even from people who otherwise would want to see an expansion of the European Union, admitting that they're simply not in the position to do it. You've seen this before, where I believe it was 2019, 2020, where Macron said that several of the Balkan states, including Albania, North Macedonia, etc., wouldn't be able to join the European Union simply because the process is too bogged down right now, and they're not in the position to take on any new members. So the good news, at least, is that European Union expansion has at least seemed to have been frozen by political procedures. However, of course, that hasn't carried over into the NATO expansion, which, in my opinion, is the more dangerous of the two beasts out of Brussels. But I'll take what I
Yeah.
can get. And with that being said, you do have just this one last piece of European news here that you have the U.S. State Department, in their complete brazenness, has come out and said that they expect Europe to completely abandon Russian energy. Now, this isn't the first of this kind of statement, but it is as brazen as before. And of course, this is from actually November 18th that the USA expects the European Union to permanently abandon energy supplies from Russia. So it returns once again to that sort of European battered wife syndrome, as I would call it, and that dynamic of it. I mean, even in the most unfiltered, brazen of Trump moments, or even with that blithering idiot Pompeo. Now, perhaps if a circumstance like this existed, but even before then, you would not have even dreamed of them uttering this, even with all the off-kilter statements that they had made towards Europe, even with all the provocative statements that they made towards Europe. That is far more brazen than anything Trump or
Yes.
any previous president has suggested up until if I mean frankly the most brazen you would have to go to even find a comparison, in which case I would argue because we're actually seeing a fulfillment of some of it is worse is going back to the Truman administration with the Morgenthau plan. And I'm not speaking hyperbolically here. And as I said, I would argue that this is worse because it
No.
actually is seeing what appears to be a long-term implementation of some degree of the Morgenthau plan.
Right. I don't think that's I don't think that's an overstatement. Um, Basically, what America has consigned for Europe is to be a backwater. Their industries will leave. They will either go to China or America, and America will get reindustrialized and have far more control over European corporations, which, if you take the German ones, for instance, played an important role in getting Nord Stream 2. Remember that Nord Stream 2 was completed before the war and was operational, but they set up laws to stop it. Um, there was a certificate that was not granted to it in order to make it operable. Um, so I think that yeah, there's a mistrust. I think in many ways, secretly, a lot of American elites were probably unhappy with Merkel uh, because she made a bid for a kind of independence. Um, generally speaking, I think when Russia and Germany get along, it's generally better for Europe. But of course, I think you have small countries that don't like that arrangement, and they have historically looked on Anglo powers as a way to mitigate that partnership. Um, so I think that's what we're seeing, like the third iteration of this since the late 1900s.
I mean, the Brest-Litovsk nations, for lack of a better term, the ones that were carved out of the former Russian Empire at the peace treaty between Russia and Germany towards the end of World War One, back then in 1918 and right now in 2022, their existence is contingent on being a dagger to Russia's throat. And
Yeah,
that is why Germany carved them out in the first place. That is why you saw efforts by France, Britain, etc., to maintain their independence even after the end of World War One. That's why you saw the focus on Poland in the interwar period. That's why World War Two, frankly, started. At least in the European theater, was that guarantee to Poland. That's why you had so much agitation in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, and that's why in the post-Cold War era you have all these countries integrated into NATO, because the sole reason that these ethnicities within Eastern Europe are allowed to have at least what are on paper sovereign states is because they serve no other purpose than being a dagger towards Russia. And once
right.
again,
Because Russia, in and of itself, as we've said for a long time, is not a country that can be swallowed whole by the EU. It would overpower it. It is why they have, ever since the early 90s, debated the question of breaking Russia up into several pieces. Not all of them. Brzezinski didn't see that happening, um, but many of them, including Soros. You can go to Soros's website, and he has an article from 1993 where he points this out. He even talks about using the Eastern Europeans against Russia to reflect what you're talking about at the moment. Um, so yeah,
and once again, just to put the caveats out there. Their ethnic grievances are there. I'm not here to comment on centuries-long feuds over various issues, both of which are probably very legitimate and some of which are probably very petty. That's not the point. I'm talking purely from the standpoint of Western nations. The reason that these smaller nations are propped up to the degree that they are is because they are viewed once again as these proxy states, as these states that will be the first wave, will be the meat grinder if push comes to shove. As you referenced that Soros article in 1993, that almost exactly describes the situation in Ukraine now. That these Eastern European
Yep.
nations will be used in order to beat Russia, and I mean, more or less, of course, he worded a bit more eloquently that Eastern European nations will be turned into a meat grinder in order to destroy Russia. And that's what we see in Ukraine right now. That's what you see with the attempt to try to expand the war in Ukraine, at least from the factions that would want the expansion. But that's ultimately what it comes down to. That's why these nations are allowed to maintain an existence in any form. And like I said, once again, not to downplay any historical grievances between the various nations of Eastern Europe, but I'm saying purely speaking from a purely objective standpoint, that's why these countries are in NATO. That's why they get so much money in aid. That's why there are Western troops there because at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, they're expected to be that first wave that charges in.
Yeah, very much so. And uh, in a sense, the longer this war goes on, the less likely those European nations will want to commit themselves in that way, which to me means like at one point or another, if America is really uh, determined to have regime change in Russia and then the eventual breakup of Russia, they will have to escalate the war. So there must be something at the moment that they're not ready for, if that's the case.
Oh yes, and as we've said before, there are factions within the empire who certainly know that's what needs to be done, and whether they're holding off on that because they don't think the time is right, or because they don't think they're in a position to, or for a variety of reasons, for some reason they are not going along with that just yet. But you had mentioned, of course, Nord Stream, which brings me into my next topic, which we'll get into some Middle Eastern news, is that there was an attempted sabotage on the Turk Stream pipeline this week. Now, of course,
Yes.
that was thwarted. This has caused a bit of a rift between Turkey and the West. And this is, of course, on top of just the souring relations in general between Turkey and the West, where they have, over the past few months, become the new Russian energy hub. They have had something of a, not entirely, but they've had an estrangement from NATO, especially, and the American Empire, where they've made some very, what can only be called pro Russia comments. And you have the political situation in the Middle East also heating up with the Kurds and in Syria, and there was a statement from the White House in relation to all this saying Turkey continues to face legitimate terrorist threats to its south and has the right to defend itself. So, giving a tacit endorsement to the current Turkish operations in both Iraq and Syria regarding the question around the Kurds. So, that's also on top of the attempts to broker a meeting between Erdogan and Assad that will take place in Moscow. Now, this is pure media speculation, and this is from a columnist that's close to the Turkish government who said that the meeting of Erdogan and Assad may take place in Russia with the mediation of Putin. So that is speculation, but it is once again from one of these journalists that is pretty close to the source. So for all I know, it could just be the same sort of media narrative that they do play. I really can't say it for sure,
Yeah.
but with the direction Turkish and Syrian relations have been going, especially with the mediation of Russia, it's not beyond the stretch of the imagination that a summit between the two leaders could be mediated in Moscow, and that would be a new step, especially on top of the increasing operations in Syria. So, unlike previous operations in Syria, this does not involve Idlib. This does not involve northwestern Syria. This is focused almost entirely on northeastern Syria, and arguably more on the Kurdish regions of northern Iraq. And
Yep.
as you said, as we saw, the White House has more or less turned a blind eye to this, and even to the point where you don't even have the media outrage about the Kurds, such as you did when Trump allegedly betrayed the Kurds in late 2019 when he said he was going to begin the process of pulling out of Syria and leaving Turkey as one of the quote unquote successors to the American operations in Syria. And you have once again another case of the Kurds being chewed up and spit out by the American empire. And it almost alludes to what we were discussing with the situation that you
I mean,
have.
essentially, America's given the green light.
Oh, yeah. And again, this alludes to the situation that we have with the Eastern Europeans, with the Ukrainians. And like Zoro said, that these people had to be a meat grinder that are more or less serving as human pawns. Now, of course, this is a complete sellout. This is a complete throwing under the bus, but the dynamic is very similar with how the U.S. has treated the Kurds for the past 30 years, ever since the first Gulf War. They're the people who will take the majority of the blows for them, but still maintain loyalty to the empire. And even after all of this, they have refused negotiation with the Syrian government over the past several years consistently, and then relied on their American backers and have been completely thrown under the bus, especially in the case of the Iraqi Kurds. And I mean, because the Syrian ones are a bit of a different question because there's still a chance for political reconciliation there. But at this point, especially after that recent terrorist attack was uh, at least attempted to be linked to the PKK, it's complete green light to go in and to have these operations. Now, given the current dynamic with Turkey and how they have drifted more and more eastward towards Russia, this is something that Washington had to do in order not to provoke the situation even further, and that is something they were willing to sacrifice, which is a very strange change in tune from what was just, I would say, over the past year or two, was almost, you saw almost a push to embolden Kurdish operations in the Middle East to counter
Yeah.
Turkey. But it seems that there has been a last minute pullback in order to appease Turkey, in order to throw a bone to them, which is to fully be expected. And I'm not shocked by that. I'm slightly shocked that it went to the degree that it did. I figured that they would have just not acknowledged it as long as possible, and perhaps that is the case given everything. But for a while there, you could safely say it looked like the U.S. was preparing for the Kurdish option when it comes to its relationship with Turkey. And perhaps there were some discussions there, perhaps there were some closed door threats, whatever you want to get into, that said, look, if you don't do X, Y, or Z, we're going to deploy the Kurdish option. Or perhaps it was, or perhaps the shoe was on the other foot, and Turkey was saying we're going to do X, Y, or Z if you don't let us take care of the Kurdish problem. And whatever sort of agreement or settlement was reached between the U.S. and Turkey, it has resulted in this. And I'm not over here weeping over the Kurds. Frankly, I I can
I
only
think, personally, I think the Kurds have actually prolonged this war in ways that, you know, um, Arab Peninsula, Israeli American interests funding jihadists in Syria have it might even eclipse them because this area is quite vast that they control, much more vast than the little cells that are peppered all throughout in that area of eastern Syria that America still controls, or Idlib. Idlib is whatever. It's a fantasy camp for people who still are attached to a caliphate. That will never happen. Now, um, you also see Iran is very emboldened. In fact, some of their forces have attacked directly an American base with ATGMs. The Turks have
not
started
only the base
bombing.
but the U.S. consulate as well.
Yeah, it's very bold. Now you also have in that part of Syria, the northeast corner, that America is using to extract oil out of Syria in order to give it to Kurds in Iran, and from there, sorry, Iraq, and from there, some of it used to go to Israel. I don't know if it still does. but it did right after 2003. So you have Turkey bombing like American proxies, even the areas where the oil is controlled, even disrupting the flow of oil. Now they've gone whole ham, and this is something that a lot of us were expecting would happen in July. In that they've started bombing like even Syrian strongholds, and this is what I mean. Like the Syrians are cooperating with the Kurds in this region, but really, like the Syrians should have genocided. Whoops,
Oh no.
jettisoned. The Syrians should have jettisoned the Kurds a long time
Oh
ago
no, and
because
especially getting into this, I sorry to interrupt, but I just have to touch on this. You talked about the Kurds prolonging this, and you can go back to 2018, 2019, especially at the beginning, especially when Afrin first fell, when you had no less than a dozen offers of reconciliation by the Syrian government, by Damascus, to the Kurds in the face of the Turkish threat. And you saw this especially during the
yeah,
2019 withdrawal, where, as U.S. forces at least announced officially that they were leaving, Damascus once again reached out to the Kurds and said that we can begin a reconciliation process. We can make sure that Turkey does not incur further onto sovereign Syrian soil. And they said, no, we're strong, we can defend ourselves. And then, of course, the narrative, once they completely collapse under the pressure, is that Donald Trump betrayed us and the American empire has abandoned us once again. And again, this is after probably over a course of 2, 3 years where you have over a dozen at least offers of reconciliation and normalization of relations between the various Kurdish factions and the Syrian government. And every time those were spurned by Kurdish leadership. And now
yeah.
they have painted themselves into a position because of their unwavering faith in the American empire that Turkey is more or less set to solve the question in probably, let's just say, the most internationally acceptable way that doesn't push too many boundaries.
Right. Now, two things more I'll say about this, and that is there are pipeline networks in this area, right? There's only one pipeline that I believe that goes from Azerbaijan towards Europe. Some deals were made. This is where Russian oil and gas is given to the Azerbaijanis. They mix it because Gazprom owns part of Azerbaijani oil and gas companies, anyways, and then it's sold to the Europeans at much higher costs. But at least they're pure. Um, so a lot of this is a battle for these pipelines, right? And for pipelines not yet made. What I see a potential happening is Iran and Turkey possibly working together. Um, we shouldn't forget that Iran right now has amassed huge forces around the Azerbaijan border, and they have a problem with Kurds as well. And you could see some kind of a deal being worked
In
out
fact,
with
the recent
Iran and Turkey.
uprisings in Iran happened over an incident that was in the Kurdish regions, and the woman that they have made the poster lady or whatever
Oh
of
yeah,
this
yeah, yeah,
recent
yeah.
protest was a Kurdish woman, and
That's right.
and you saw the uprisings there. You saw the uprisings in the Iranian controlled parts of what I suppose they would call Iranian Azerbaijan. And as you said, there's the massing on the border. You have the Azeris saying we're preparing for war. And on top of this, while the Azeris is preparing for war, you have Pashinyan being what is effectively completely spurning the CSTO at this time and
Yes,
trying
yes.
further
And
integration
and
into
isn't
the
it
West.
funny? He does this the next day. There's a protest that's crushed in Kazakhstan. That very next day.
Of course. I mean, I, look, somebody was saying back when it flared up again, before things calmed down to the point where they more or less are now, that I can't remember. I wish I could give proper credit. That by the 22nd century, there's likely not going to be an Armenian state, and I would say even that's a bit of a stretch, it being that long. And given this current trajectory, the Armenians will be subsumed. Now, will there be an Armenian people still? Probably to some degree. Will the Armenian people have a demographic collapse? I would say similar to what Serbia suffered in the 20th century, I would say so. I mean, and this isn't to downplay the Armenian genocide because while that did have a lot of casualties, they still managed to survive and arguably even thrive in large parts of the diaspora, whether that be in places uh, like the Levant or even in North America as well, where there is still recognizable Armenian presence there. And I'm sure they will continue, but they continue to drift away from the homeland that they left behind. But Armenians in Armenia proper run the risk of becoming a permanent minority at best in their own homeland. And look, I know
It's
it's
actually terrifying.
yeah,
I
I know it's reductive to place the blame on one man, but given a long view of history, centuries long view of history, I believe if things continue on the current trajectory, if there is not a changing of the guard in a very rapid manner, Nikol Pashinyan will be remembered as the man who destroyed the Armenian people.
yeah. I don't know what it is that he wants, right? And they have a very interesting way of trying to frame this as Russia isn't doing enough, right? Like Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine. They crushed an uprising in Kazakhstan. There's another, and it's still not over with, right? They just crushed another protest. Like you want what is it that you want, right? You want to because again, it's the same siren song, right? The US propaganda basically says, listen, just do as we say, and this applies to the Kurds, it applies to the Ukrainians. Just listen to what we say, we'll make you rich. It's for the Kurds, you'll even get your own country. Just stick with us, and all will be well. Now, I know Pashinyan, he's part of that 2018 revolution that ousted the former pro-Russian president. And look at his situation right now. He's not obviously a good wartime leader. The country is very discouraged. Um, Russia did not work a miracle because,
They've
Russia has
almost
too many interests.
publicly they've almost publicly overthrown him and put him, let's just say, on a Ceausescu style trial several times. Now they haven't succeeded yet, and some could argue that's unfortunate, but they've almost done that to him multiple times. They've stormed into Parliament multiple times upon these peace agreements, where I don't know how the man is honestly still near power and actually still even breathing at this point. And I well, I know it's, and I mock Westerners when they do this about their politicians, but I think the scenario is far different. Just to give that caveat, that if this man is not removed as far away from power as possible in the near future, like I said, that's it for the Armenian nation. That's it for the Armenian people.
Yeah, uh, it was an enormous mistake. They had the upper hand back 4 or 5 years ago, and I don't know. Does he think like Macron or Brandon is going to save Armenia? They will. I mean, the Central Asian Security Organization is like it's not great, obviously, right? It's hardly anything like NATO. But for Armenia, if we're talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, like it's the best option he has. I'm not saying that Putin can deliver what he wants from him. What so I don't know. I mean, basically, this area is a potential second front in order to pull Russia away. The Caucasus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Serbia, Kosovo. These are the three possible fronts, besides the other ones, but these are the three most likely fronts to pull Russia away. And I just think that Russia is willing to sacrifice Armenia if because remember there's Russian troops that are stationed there. Um, and like let's not forget, Azerbaijan is an absolute hyena in all of this. They're like they're worse than Pashinyan. Pashinyan is terrible because he's weak and because he weakened Armenia for ousting somebody that was more pro-Russian, right? That's his problem. But Azerbaijan is only following what took place in Armenia in the first place. They saw a lessening of Russian influence and they went for it. They saw weakness in Pashinyan and they went for it. That's what this
Oh,
boils
absolutely.
down to.
And getting back to what you're saying about Armenia being the finger that can be lost, so to speak, is they more or less already did that to Georgia. Now, of course, there's still Abkhazia and South Ossetia that are more or less independent, de facto independent. But when it comes to that, Georgia proper has more or less been lost to Russia. And although it's not ideal to not have the South Caucasus in their back pocket, it's certainly less pertinent than somewhere like Kazakhstan, somewhere like Ukraine, and somewhere even like the Balkans at that point. So
Mm-hmm.
they find themselves in an unfortunate position where they're the lowest priority, and that is once again in large part thanks to the Color Revolution government, the Soros-backed government that is in charge to this day.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
perhaps if things turned out different, I mean, arguably, if the 2018 Color Revolution never happened, you wouldn't have gotten this case. You wouldn't have had something like this occur. But unless Russia's preparing for total war, after a certain point, Armenia is probably going to be lost, unfortunately. And again, I have no animus against Armenians or anything, but I don't see any viable path in the future and in which they can really survive as either a nation state or a people, because they will be driven out. They will be driven further into diaspora, and I think that's all you can really say about it. I mean, and again, where are they going to go? The dynamic of the world has changed so much in the past century. When, of course, when they went to Syria and Palestine and Lebanon in the 1920s, those were European mandates. When they went to the United States in the 1920s,
Yeah.
that was a far different nation than it is today. It was a nation on the ascent, at least in terms of material living conditions. Where are they going to go? Europe, which is deindustrializing itself and going to be forced to be a backwater by the American Empire. Do you think Russia is going to let in massive amounts of Armenian migrants? I know a lot of people have said Putin's weak on the migration issue, but I simply now I could be wrong. I don't see that.
Yeah, I don't
Are
either.
they going to go to Turkey? I doubt that. Are they going to go elsewhere in the Middle East? I mean, what options do they have at this point?
Right. And I think here's what we should be on the lookout for in the next week, two, three. And that is what was actually said at the CSTO, right? Um, was it that um, Pashinyan is disagreeing with Putin and the other members over a kind of security arrangement that he's not happy with? In other words, Russia isn't doing enough, or uh, is it because, and that could include, Azerbaijan preparing to go to war with uh, Armenia, or is Azerbaijan preparing to go to war with Iran? Right? Like, I know that's more of an outside chance, but that's probably something that like we should. I mean, I know we will, but that's something we should look for in the coming weeks.
Oh, and of course, especially with the current approach towards Iran, which I'm going to touch on a little, Azerbaijan could very easily find itself as a proxy in that as well, because you have U.S. pressure ramping up. Of course, you did have the strikes on the U.S. consulate and forces in northern Iraq. You had strikes on U.S. forces in northeastern Syria. And you also had threats at other American forces in the region where the current escalation continues. You have more posturing in the Middle East on the American part. And like you said, it could come to the point where, and of course, it was just the Azeri government saying that we are preparing for war, giving a very brazen statement like that. They didn't say towards who. Most people would assume Armenia, but again, the situation with Iran and Azerbaijan has not been ideal. You recall in the past two flare-ups, the ones in 2020 and the ones this year, especially the one this year, you actually had IRGC forces moving to the Armenian border in what looked like a move that was going to support the Armenians against Azerbaijan. So it could be that instead of a direct U.S. intervention there, it's just going to be more of the provoking, such as the protests, such as these swell up in terrorist attacks that you've been seeing. And who knows, the capstone to all of this could be trying to spark a conflict between Iran and Azerbaijan at this point.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think if we look at the last 6, 7 years, the Russians, um, you know, Armenia is not as big a priority as Georgia, for obvious reasons that have to deal with security. And if Armenia showed, disloyalty, then there's really nothing that Russia can do for them. And it's the same in the Balkans, With my country, they eventually, our elites were replaced with elites that were um, completely obedient to the US. And we've denigrated ourselves as a result. And you cannot expect Russia now to come to your defense, or to stop you know, the cultural nullification that happens wherever there's strong American influence. So, yeah.
And the last piece of Middle Eastern news I will leave you with before we get into some domestic news is that Israel has said that they will be able to supply high precision ballistic missiles to Ukraine if Iran starts supplying missiles to Russia. And that was said by the head of
Mm.
the National Security Council, Elal Holvat. So Israel is once again posturing, and especially given the Iran issue, that pressure is only going to increase. And I would frankly be very surprised if we don't see some degree of conflict break out in or around Iran within the next 6 months, given the trajectory of everything right now. And the Azerbaijan situation opens up a whole new angle to that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this area is rife for all kinds of stuff to happen, and it is just as wild and indeterminate as Syria has been, with like a 3, 4 way war.
And again, we'll ultimately see how that plays out, especially with the American empire that desperately needs to secure victory. Although this situation in Ukraine has not been ideal for Russia, it certainly has been the victory the American empire was hoping for. And with that being said, I do have some news about the home front of the empire. So
Mhm.
I hate that the show. Actually, no, I don't hate that the show has come to this. I love the I love these two stories because they're just so entertaining. So Donald Trump has been officially unbanned from Twitter after, of course, new Twitter owner Elon Musk actually had a poll on the website asking whether Donald Trump should be unbanned. It was a narrow lead for him. He won with about 52.8% of the vote, and his account was fully restored. Now, Trump said, due to his previous treatment by the website and due to his endeavors with websites like Truth Social, that he has no intention to return to Twitter. I imagine if he actually was, I mean, and he,
Truth
of course,
Social is amazing. You should go on it.
oh yeah, yeah. I trust my data with these shady websites. Oh yeah, all those alt websites which never leak your data. That's never happens, never will happen. But of course, Trump has announced for 2024, as we've previously covered, and I can only imagine as a campaign becomes more serious. After a certain point, whether he wants to or not, Twitter is going to become a necessity just because of the reach of the platform. So he has been unbanned with that. And then you had Elon Musk continuing further with the Twitter polls, where this one was voted in, I think it was like a 75% majority. Should accounts that were unfairly terminated under dubious rules, such as, I'm sure you all remember when the accounts on Twitter were getting banned en masse for spam, should they be restored? That poll passed overwhelmingly. Musk said he was going to begin a process for appeals and restorations of previously banned accounts starting this upcoming week for the upcoming Monday. So you do have a shift in narrative. Not that I think Twitter is going to be this great tool in order to change politics that much. It certainly does change public discourse, and it certainly does change public opinion. It changes the way people perceive things, especially now that it has become a, you could at least say, marginally more open platform, and it's become something that you do see where it's not as regulated as before. The trends are, let's just say, less astroturf. Not that they're not astroturf at all, but there is more frank discussion going on there. Now, you could argue, in which case I'm inclined to lean towards, that it is something of a pressure valve. They let people vent on the internet. They let people vent on social media. It's an escape. It leads to less pent up energy. It leads to less potential for people to take, let's say, more drastic actions rather than making posts on the internet. And you could argue that's the direction it's going in right now, but I do think that it's going to be a slight positive change. Now, as we'll see with the upcoming election, we'll see how that actually holds or how long Musk even holds on to Twitter, because I mean that situation's uncertain. With the kind of, let's just say, fickle personality he is, we could see the site sold or under new management very quickly. I wouldn't be surprised with that if this is a very short-lived thing. I'm not going to say for certain, but from at least what I know about Musk, it wouldn't surprise me if this is just a very short-term endeavor before he moves on to his next vanity project. But it will be interesting to see how this does affect the discourse with elections, and especially given some of the, let's just say, controversy in states like Arizona and Nevada in the 2022 midterms. Not that I'm personally alleging anything, but I'm just saying there were controversy. There were people who were, and of course we condemn them, and in line with YouTube terms of service, blah 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 blah. But I mean, you could see, depending on what kind of course, completely legal through the avenues of free speech and the First Amendment, blah blah blah, all the necessary caveats. What kind of pressure is put on state officials in, let's just say, contentious states like Nevada, like Pennsylvania, like Arizona? How a, let's say, marginally more open Twitter or marginally more open social media in general would affect the process of that? Would it lead to, let's just say, less suspicion on other people's parts, or but I mean ultimately I'll go back to this. I think it's ultimately just a pressure valve. It's to let people vent their frustrations in a way that isn't really going to move the needle all that much, and frankly let people feel like they're going to be making a much larger difference than they are through the whole voice the people thing. And again, Musk has played into this public discourse and shift opinion so much. I mean, not that it's completely powerless, but compared to how power actually functions in terms of like major changes that would need to happen, it's not going to happen because I get 1,000 likes on Twitter, as much as I hate to say it.
Right. And, this brings me back to something that academic agent brought up. I have a few things to say about the whole thing about Musk coming back, because it's not least of all complicated. So, back in April, this is what he predicted or suggested the regime would do if it was clever. If the regime is clever, which it currently shows no signs of being, it will allow the right a few token wins here and there to achieve one of its strongest weapons, containment. For example, elite. For example, the elite should fire the current CEO of Disney. He was just fired this week. Support the anti-groomer bill in Florida. Allow Elon Musk to buy Twitter. Allow Musk to unban Donald Trump, and then allow Trump to win the next election in 2024. Why? It would win back millions upon millions of Americans who have totally lost faith in the nation and its institutions. The regime needs these people as cannon fodder for its wars as cattle to usher into its sports spectacles and whatnot. The center right is the backbone of any regime, and the current center right is viewed widely as a joke by the entire theoretical base of support. The regime has a genuine problem on its hands in this regard, as it increasingly struggles to mask its own unpopularity. Instead of making those effective containment moves of the sort that Tony Blair would make, to make us back to the proverbial Fresh Prince, the regime bleats about the right-wing extremism. So that's that's interesting, because I remember when he said that on one of his shows. And um okay, so there's several things that have transpired since, and it's not just that um Trump is back, but what Trump coming back has meant, even though Trump has not done anything. So, Greenblatt of the ADL, of course, who became furious with Kanye West and demanded, Basically reached out to Nike and all these other brands, and you know, Yi went from being a billionaire to a millionaire overnight. Uh, Basically, Greenblatt started to make threats to Twitter. You know, it didn't have to be this way, but Twitter's own future is questionable. Like really, really strong language. And then what finally happened, for the first time, let's say in 8 or 9 years that I can remember, is you had other Jews on Twitter saying, Greenblatt's not good for us, including the magazine Tablet. So that was an interesting little tidbit. The other is, I believe there was let me find it. There were accounts that were associated with, basically sending out, you know, pedo hashtags. And as it turned out, a lot of
A
them,
large
surprise,
overlap with a lot of major leftist activists.
that's right, including this one account by Chad Loader. Musk actually spoke directly with Ramsey Paul. That's the other thing. He's engaging directly with these guys. Like, I know this is containment. Like, okay, it's containment, but I still think it's newsworthy that this is happening because he's doing it in a really big way. He's like, we know that he fired 75% of the staff, and the place is functional, right? It didn't tank. Uh, there's already talk that there are pundits on MSNBC and CNN that are saying Russia is going to return to Twitter. This is a very big deal. It's security, it's this and that. I'm very sure Greenblatt already last week has spoken to Apple and Google to take Twitter off the platform. You are seeing huge scores of left wingers leaving. Um, that guy that I
Join
just
Mastodon,
mentioned.
guys.
What's that?
Join Mastodon.
Yeah. Chad Loader even made a list. I think you sent it to me, right?
Yes.
5,000 accounts that could be implicated with ties to Antifa and ergo ties to pushing, you know, pedo hashtags. One of them was Nirvana, of all things.
Oh
Although
dear lord.
I remember Kurt Cobain really went out of his. I mean, he wasn't gay; he was a troubled guy. But uh, you know, but he went really out of his way to signal back in the '90s. That was the thing to signal how gay accepting you were. That was the way you signaled you were a good moral liberal. So I just find it interesting because, like, as we know, like even the Foo Fighters and all these other, Rage Against the Machine. All these people are pro this regime. They always have been. They always have been. Um, so I find it interesting that all of this stuff is happening. Um, it could be containment. It probably is, but it could backfire too. In any case, it's a move out of weakness. And when there's an intra elite struggle for power, the weaker elite who don't have as much power, either symbolic or financial, they will reach out to the public. It's at this point where, you know, you might get what you want or get more of what you want. It doesn't mean, and it could go completely the other way. We know about, well, just take the Russian Revolution. If you think it was bad under the Tsar, wait till the Soviets come in, right? But that was under the illusion because you had priests protesting in 1917 who um, were talking about starvation. People were starving. And there was a supposition that the Bolsheviks were on their side. Well, in the next revolt, which was successful, that obviously wasn't the case. On the other hand, you could have, like, historically, a Caesar comes in, and a Caesar is basically, he's in the center. He's not really extreme this or extreme that. He is extremely pragmatic, however, and that can change the course of things, and it can, uh, heal divisions. I don't know what's going to happen in the U.S. Uh, I don't see how a lot of these divisions can be overcome, uh, simply because the demographics are so divergent, and there is still no slowing down on mass immigration, legal and illegal, that I don't see how it could work feasibly. So who knows? Who knows how this could go? But uh, Musk is not. He's very willing to, like, engage with these people. I don't know if you saw that tweet by Reich. Reich was complaining about Twitter, and
Robert
um,
Reich was complaining.
yeah,
Never.
and Musk just replies, "Interesting. Pay the $8." he's done a he's done a ton of these. I mean, it's very gratifying to see this, right? And, like, there's a very good likelihood that Greenblatt is not going to be leading the ADL in the next month or two. He could get fired. You don't hear from him very much anymore, and you heard a lot from him before. In the spring, when it looked like Musk would buy Twitter. You definitely heard a lot when Kanye made some of his tweets. Interesting is that once Kanye's account was reinstated, his first tweet was "Shalom." It's just too much. Anyhow, so we don't know what's going to happen, but it's a bit of a wild ride. It is a containment, but even a containment could go wrong. I think we have to keep our minds loose and intuitive that way, instead of, because I know how much all of us have looked for somebody to save us, right?
I mean,
um
and
we'll
look,
see how much of a containment this is.
a lot of these examples are trite, but for example, in 2000, Putin was a containment. In
Oh,
2010,
yes.
Orban was a containment. And like,
Yes.
I'm not trying to compare the situation in the modern West to Hungary or Russia 10 to 20 years ago, but point being is there's times where they do have to scrape the bottom of the barrel, and it still doesn't work for them. And for a minute there, I thought Trump may have been that. And again, we alluded
Hmm.
to that, but it's called scraping the bottom of the barrel for a reason. These aren't their first choices to be the people who they have to corral us, but they're the people that they have to employ. But again, there's still a great risk in doing that. But it's either they don't take that risk and they continue on with their same failed policies and they aggravate the situation further, or they hope that the pressure valve works, but the pressure valve, once again, doesn't always work. So it's a risk they have to take. But point being is, within that risk, there's opportunity for, let's just say, people like us.
Right, and we shouldn't forget, like, Musk is supplying Starlink to the Ukrainians. Trump was the first president to give Ukraine lethal attack weapons. Uh, he's the first to sanction Nord Stream 2.
He moved the embassy.
It
He recognized the Golan
moved
Heights. All this stuff.
right, right. So it's not like it's that's why I say it's a containment. Absolutely. We're just going to have to see where it goes. Um, of course, the problem is when you talk to, like, some people are very,
Purist, I would
twice
say.
twice purists, and also twice shy. Let's say particularly people who supported Trump, right? In a way, they've been so scathed by that and with them, they didn't really care whether he armed Ukraine or not. Um, he just couldn't accomplish anything in the U.S. itself. So yeah, I mean, I try to look at these things as potentials, not as, this is it, it's our guy, we're saved. far from it, especially after Trump.
Oh, absolutely. And again, like our guy, quote unquote, isn't just going to come out of nowhere. And I will reiterate what I've said for years. And there's nothing wrong with the purism in the right time in the right place, but opportunity must be taken where it is found. And maybe it's not ideal for. I mean, Donald Trump would not have been my first choice for an American revival, and that's back when I still believed an American revival was possible, mind you. But
Yeah,
point being is, you have to work with what you can get, and you have to use that to try to push the needle as far as you can in your direction. And look, let's be honest, a lot of the times it doesn't work, a lot of the times it isn't that much at all, but it's a non-0% chance. It's either you take the non-0% chance, even if it's a 0.1% chance, that's still better than a guaranteed failure.
right. If anything, you want them to continue to make mistakes, right? At the very least, you want them to be making mistakes. That their incompetence is the number one feature that they're known for. That's when things can really happen, right? That's when you might find somebody who is sincere and thinks like the ship has to be rescued at this point. We can't go in this direction anymore. And that's understandable because it is that way. I mean, as we said earlier in the show, you have rhetoric like it's do or die for NATO, the West, America, the whole thing on a daily basis. Someone is going to say that. Um, and we're in the crunch right now. Like we've just begun the new chapter. Deindustrialized Europe, um, much higher prices for energy, uh, probably globally for quite a while. Um, Maybe a war that goes on for years. Um, it, you
Or
know,
maybe even
even
multiple
if
wars.
yes, multiple wars. A migrant crisis that is not addressed. Yeah.
That's really all I can put to that. And then I just do have a last couple bit of U.S. news items to land on let's just say much more.
Oh, we forgot Merkel.
Um, I'll get into that after this, but
Okay.
just on much more conventional notes, it did come out that Biden did pressure Canada over the trucker protests to have a harsher crackdown on them. Now, keep in mind this isn't a great defense of Trudeau or his government, but point being is there was direct interference by the American government asking for a much harsher crackdown on the truckers, which I mean are still ongoing today, and they're trying to once again turn this into the Canadian J6 with that. You have the diesel shortage, which by the time you watch this, by the time this premieres, it will be November 27th. November 28th, at the day after this premieres, will be the moment of truth. See if it really comes to fruition. And then you have the Biden administration giving Chevron oil permission to permission to drill for oil in Venezuela, and that is to avert the current energy crisis. They have tapped into the reserves again as gas prices have been temporarily lowered. As I did predict that they would likely let Thanksgiving weekend go by with relatively lower or stable gas prices in order to just not raise too much ire in the public, just to keep things calm and on on the down low, so to speak. But yeah, just to close out, why don't you fill us in on a bit of this Merkel news?
Yeah. So Merkel had an interview. I believe it was in Der Spiegel, where she lamented that there couldn't be a Minsk three, and blame Putin because all Putin wants is power. Like honestly, it was a horrible piece. She, as I hinted through the show, she's really just trying to conceal her own ambitions for Germany, which are laudable, right? And given the situation that the Germans are in post World War II, But her characterization of Putin was ridiculous. And to unpack this, like, let's look at Minsk One. So Minsk One happens because the Ukrainians lose against the Novorossiyans, the Donbass people, in August of 2014. It's not followed, and of course, according to Poroshenko in late 2019, or whenever he made that video, he never had any intention of following any of the Minsk agreements, right? And so the Ukrainians go for it again, and they try to retake the Baltsovo, or had already retaken it. They're on the point of collapse. They've suffered heavy losses. There's rumors of 200 to maybe even 1,000 NATO guys in there. And Merkel, without even a translator, immediately contacts Putin. I forget whether she actually went to Moscow, but spoke to him directly. Of course, Putin is fluent in German, but I bring up the fact that there were no translators simply because it's been many years since Putin actually had to speak German,
And even just for the
right?
sake of the formality, even if you do have it, there always
Yes,
is some sort
exactly.
of, and like I said, even like for example, between two English-speaking leaders, such as you get with Canada, the U.S., or
Yes.
Canada and America,
Someone has to
Canada and
transcribe the
Britain. Yeah,
meeting.
so, like they have like some sort of staff there, some sort of entourage that travels with them, and I'm sure there was that, but in terms of leaders between two states that speak different languages, it's just let's say it's very informal, and
Right.
it's a sign of either informality or urgency, as we saw with the
Yeah.
latter.
Tremendous urgency, right? And so Minsk 2 is drawn up. There's supposed to be a review of the Minsk Accords every 6 months, right? And, Zelensky, even in December 2019, was very positive. He met with Putin, I believe, in France. Macron invited them, and it looked like all was going well. And then in February of 2020, he completely switched. He went to Donbass, to the Luhansk area, and, like, there was, there's a video where he's in the trenches where the right wing battalions are threatening him or just mocking him, and then there's another video where he essentially acquiesces. It's over. And but the main thing I want to draw to about the interview, right, is um, yeah, the Minsk agreements were created. That was supposed to stabilize the whole situation, but every opportunity that there was to throw sanctions on Russia, you did, right? Like the Brits were very upset that they were not included, right? In these talks, in these agreements, they're not an official member. Neither was the U.S. And they became very upset by that. And I think that's also one of the reasons why we have this war. Putin didn't do this because he was lusting after power. Like, if he was doing that, he would have sent in the entire army into Ukraine. So, anyways, I just thought that was it revealed like how duplicitous the whole thing was from the beginning, right? And in a way, how naive maybe the Russians were. Maybe they always knew it. Maybe they always knew that like they wouldn't be good on it. Maybe the Minsk Accords were just to buy time, right?
I mean, if you have
Uh,
Poroshenko, who outright said that this is just to buy us 4 or 5 years before we can mount a proper army, while again, not like casting moral aspersions at really either side at this point, but I'm sure that when it went through Putin and the Russian negotiators, that they had a very similar mindset that this is just to alleviate the situation for the time being until we can figure out a greater plan for this. It's just that the Ukrainians were far more
right.
on the nose about it because they were in a position to be.
Right. And Merkel was fully aware. It was demonstrable that Ukraine was not following Minsk, right? Because they just made more laws against speaking Russian. They fired more Russian speaking people. They demonized Russians even more so on TV, right? There was no effort whatsoever. There was a truce that was continually broken. Um, but really, that was just, that's a static front while while your forces are preparing for a major offensive. So I just thought it was hilarious that she made that statement, and she talked about going to Russia before just a month or two, and saying, no one will listen to me because they know my time is up, and so on and so on. Um, but I think that was another example of the Europeans, trying to use although she started the project with Nord Stream before Trump was elected, but in different ways, she used the Trump presidency as a way to build independence from America by claiming they felt more insecure because of Russia, because the true American leadership was not there. It was such a lie, and now they're all paying for it. I just thought that was you know, in light of everything else, I thought it was a very funny article to publish now.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just the further tarnishing at least Merkel's foreign policy legacy, which I mean, it isn't surprising. I suppose this is what happens when you deviate too far from the standard course, as you could argue Merkel did with a lot of her policies regarding Nord Stream and regarding just cooperation with Russia in general. That it was sort of inevitable that as soon as she left power, it would end up like this. Now,
Yeah, yeah.
what I was
She probably did prolong the peace. I don't think she was like, I'm not claiming she's completely ineffectual at all,
oh no,
right?
not at all.
Obviously, she accomplished a few things, and and probably abated the war for about 2 years, 3 years, maybe. Who knows? But she probably did abate it for some time.
And you could argue that she left her post when she did for that reason, so she wouldn't have to be the one to manage this crisis. At least I would argue that.
Hmm.
Um,
I would agree.
but what I would also argue, or what I not necessarily argue, but say what I'm surprised about is that Schloss I expected to be much more in line with the Merkel foreign policy. Once again, if this happened under Merkel's watch, you could
Mm.
probably expect the same response from her. But I shouldn't be surprised, but it is a bit surprising to see Germany go to the lengths that it has. Of course, it's always going to acquiesce to the American empire as it has and as it will continue to do. But I was just shocked at the extent to the point where once again we are seeing practically the unfolding of the Morgenthau plan right before us.
Yeah, tragic.
And that's all I had for this week. Thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of The War Report, and we will continue to be with you for as long as we can. Of course, we do have our alternative platforms, which will be linked below. And we're growing ever closer to the end of the year, and the 2022 in Review show is going to be a great project that we still have under works right now. It's probably going to be a two-parter. I mean, at this rate, it's going to be like 3.5, 4 hours. But if you guys are going to stick through it, I appreciate it. But that is, I will say once again,
We should
just
probably have Geo on.
absolutely. And I don't know, maybe if Vile Varangian has returned from the trenches now, I can't say whether that's where he actually is or not. But if he ever resurfaces on the internet again, we certainly need to talk to him because it's been far too long, especially given everything else that has happened thus far. But thank you
Hmm.
everyone for tuning in, and we will see you next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care, guys.